Hello, I hope you're doing great. Today, we are going to learn or talk about one of the many ways in which you can auto-translate your .NET web apps. In this case, we are using Fairplay 2, which is a Blazor Web Assembly application with a .NET Core hosted API. So, how do we do? Before we continue, please remember to visit fairplay2.pdicostarica.com, click the Buy Me a Coffee icon, and select a donation of your preference. This will help us keep the videos and products free for you. Okay, so let's continue. Let's go to Visual Studio, and you will see in here that I have this services.add hosted service, and I am adding this translations dot background translation service class. This class is a class inheriting from a background service class, and basically it is code that will be executing in the background. Okay, so we create a constructor, we inject all of the services. In the case of background services, you cannot just inject um, a lot of the objects because they are kind of a scope and things like that, right? So instead, what you need to do is inject the iServices scope factory, and you will get your registered dependencies from the services scope factory. We'll see it in a second. So when you inherit from the background service class, you will have an overridden execute async method. And you see that here we are invoking this process method and we are passing the stopping token. Okay. So in the process method, you see that here we have an instance of the scope. So we create a scope from the services scope factory, right? Now we have a scope from which we can retrieve the registered dependencies um, with a given lifetime, with a given lifetime they were registered. Okay, so we get the instance of the database context, right? We get it from the service provider, right? Um, you see, scope.service provider, we get the translation service. So this is the translation service. And now here is the interesting part for this specific application. Okay, so if you had seen the videos before and if you have seen the Fairplay 2 code, you will know that the technique we decided to use was not using resource files, but instead having the default resource keys um, hard coded to the code, right? Um, because those will be the default translation, and that will be just for the initial load of the application to work. And then the auto translator will run, will insert the the resource keys into the database, and the web application is actually retrieving all of the resource keys from the database, right? So yeah, the hard-coded keys are used for the initial load, right? Because if you publish the application and you don't have either resource files or default resource keys and you use and you read the data from the resource keys, you will probably see empty fields and the actual name of the resource key instead of the value, right? So we need to have that. And we are using some special or custom attributes to indicate how to retrieve the fields, where to retrieve them from. So in here, what we do is we get the client app assembly, and the client app assembly we can get it from using the type of .assembly, and to the type of we will pass the client .program. This is the program class in the client project. Then we get all of the types which are registered in the client app assembly. Then we get the components assembly, the models assembly, the services assembly, the commons assembly. Um, if you want, you can go and inspect the solution and or find all of the DLLs in the solution directory or something like that to retrieve all of the assemblies and then to retrieve all of the um, types for each of those. But if you don't do that um, with a pattern like prefix names and things like that, you will end up retrieving a lot of assemblies and types that you do not need to translate or because they do not participate in the UI, right? So for the moment, this is as soon as you need a new assembly and new set of types in here, you just add it to a list, right? For now. So you see types to check, and we pass all of the types which are in all of the assemblies we had in there, right? Then um, we iterate through all or through each of the types, right? We get the type full name, and the type full name will be the single type to check dot full name. Then we get the fields. We are basically getting the public fields, which are static, right? We flatten the hierarchy, right? And then we iterate through all of the fields that we retrieve, right? And we get the custom attribute named resource key or from the type resource key attribute, which is the attribute or the custom attribute we are using to register the default resource key. We will say it in a second. So we get the resource key, and if the resource key attribute is not null, and this thing has a value, we okay, this gets all of the resource attributes for a single field, right? So if there is at least one, we go to actually get the attribute. So you see resource key attribute, we know there's only one in our case, so we do single. We get the default value. The default value is going to be the key attribute default value. The key is going to be the row constant value, and the entity we are going to get the matching item in the resource table in the database, right? So we get from the resource table, we get any item which has culture ID equals 1, which this is the default, that's for English. The database key column is equals to the key or the row constant value from the key attribute in the object or the field we are iterating. The database column type column or the tables type column is going to be equals to the type full name, and when that's equal we are going to get the entity, right? So if the entity is null, we need to insert a new entity because that value hasn't been inserted in the database, right? So we in that part we are basically adding the default values for the English culture. The default values, and we are using the English culture also as the default culture to use in the system. Okay, if the change tracker has any changes, we do the save as sync. Okay, now we get all of the English US keys, right? We get the resource, we include the culture, we get where the culture name equals EN US. We convert this to a list or to an array. You can convert it to anything you want. In here, I am getting this translate request item array. And in this translate request items array, I am getting or selecting from the all English US keys, I am translating the request text item, and we are basically creating an array where the text property is going to be the value of the key, right? And then we get the additional supported cultures. The additional supported cultures are going to be all of the cultures which are in the culture table, which are different from the English US, which is the default, right? And now I iterate through through each of the additional cultures and see that I pass the translate request item, right? Culture translations, translate service, translate async, we pass the translate request items, right? And you see we pass the model or the object array of items we are going to translate, the source language, and the destination or the target language, as well as the cancellation token. So in here we know that these are always in English because we configure in here in the steps before. We configure it like that in the steps before. The single additional culture.name, it's going to be the target language, right? Then we get the culture entity, which for that language or culture we are iterating through, right? And then we iterate through all of the culture translations. See that this culture translations is actually the result of the translate async method. We will see the translate async method in a second. So here we get the single English US key, right? So we get it, right, using the position we are iterating. We get the translated value. In this case, we only care about the first item in the translations because we are using Azure Translator behind the scenes. And the Azure Translator basically gives you a sorted list of translations, and that is being sorted by the confidence score. Basically, the first items in the list are going to be the ones which are supposed to have a more accurate translation. And anyway, this is a first pass translation to have the uh, automatic generation of cultures, right? That to improve the quality of your system, it will be better for someone for later go to an administrative page and enhance or improve the translated text, right? Okay, now we get the resource entity, so we get it from the resource table, right, where the key is equals to the English US key, the type is equals to this English US key type, right? Now, if the resource entity is null, we are going to insert this resource, right? So we get the key, we get the type, we get the translated value, and we set the culture ID to the culture we are iterating. We are using here the US English key and US English key, like the key and the type, because those are the values we already know and we configured before. And this is to have the key and, and the type. We will see it in a second. The value, right? This we do have to use the translated value. And in here, we use the culture ID we are iterating through. So this is effectively creating a new set or the new set of resource keys into the database, but these are the translated keys in the specified or supported cultures, right? And then we continue. Okay, so let's see. A couple of things you need to see. We have this resource key attribute. This is a custom attribute we implemented, and you see this is basically a class that inherits from the attribute class. And the attribute usage is going to be configured to be for fields only. So basically, this resource key attribute, you will only be able to use it in a field, or remember that is a field. The default value is going to be the default value for this specific instance of the resource key in the property or the field that you specify in. So let's see, we go to final references, and you will see that, for example, we have this class. This class is the PayPal checkout.razor.cs class. And you see that in here I have this resource key, right? We have this constant public constant string add fonts text key, and this is the key. So this is the property name and this is the actual key. This value is the one that will be inserted into the database as the actual key for this type. And the default value the for that key is going to be this text. So this is the name of the property of this specific property, right? The one that holds this data. This is going to be the value of the database column that we are going to use to find this specific key for this specific type. And this is going to be the value that we will be rendering. So you will see that in the PayPal checkout razor, I have this localizer and we are getting something from this key. So in the localizer, we are using or getting something with this index, right? Which is add fonts text, and then it will give us the default, the actual value, right? We will see that code later on. So that's one of the first things you need to know. Then in the database project, you will see that in here we have the resource table. The resource table has the type, the key, and the value. This is the full qualified name of the type where those properties with the resource key attribute reside. This is the actual key, this is the actual value, and this is the actual culture. And we have culture in here, which are the default cultures. Actually, the supported cultures, I'm sorry. And then you will see that we have some implementation of the localizer that you will see in here. So let's see. Okay, so you see that in here I have implemented this add singleton iString localizer factory, use EF string localizer factory, and this iString localizer factory implementing or using this implementation EF string localizer. So these EF string localizer are basically, or these two classes are basically customized classes that will look for the resources into the database, right? So see, these get all the strings, include ancestor cultures or not, right? We get the information from the resource. So in this case, I get all of the resources that are in this table. I am including the culture and I am selecting a new localized string where I pass the key and the value. And here, if someone is looking for some specific name, we do pretty much the same, but we only return the first or default value where this happens. Actually, I probably can change this to single or default. And where this key is equal to this part can actually go in here too. But yeah, this is the way in which we are basically getting the information from the database, and this is the one for for when using generic. See that this one is actually called EF string localizer, and we are using generics. So you will see that somewhere around here we should be getting, yeah, type full name equals type of t dot full name, right? And then we look for this type full name, and that's how we find the items. Same in here, right? So that's how we are retrieving everything. So basically, you do register the iString localizer factory, the iString localizer, and you pass the EF string localizer factory to implement this interface, this one to implement this other interface, and then you modify the code to be able, so it actually reads information from the database itself, right? So I hope this video has been useful. Thank you very much for watching. And on the next session, we will talk a little bit more about how you consume all of these from a Blazor Web Assembly website. But this is the part, uh, the actual basic bits that you need to be able to engage the localization. Right? Have a great day.